anytime I get a founder on the show, it's like, I want to hear the story. I want to know all about how this began. So the mic is yours. Please tell us, how did you go from, even getting inspired to have the idea to the operation that you have today? Like, we want to hear it all.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, we've been through an incredibly rough 2.5 years, and it's amazing to think that, what was it, about 13, 14 years ago, we had another really tough period. It was the Great Recession, which followed President Obama's election, which I was a volunteer in and was incredibly inspired by. I also, at the time, was working on the No on Prop 8 campaign, which was a marriage equality campaign in California, which we lost. And it was kind of wild to come through that election and feel that my own marriage was nullified on one side, which felt like a real slap in the face. But here we had this new president and sense of hopefulness and sense of community service that he was fostering. And what I left that election with was a feeling of wanting to do more, but also wanting to do something locally. And at the time, I was a documentary photographer, and my biggest focus was on sustainability and food systems. And I was really clear on what it took to feed the most well-fed nation on the planet. And sadly, that was on the back of migrant farm workers. And I had done a book and an exhibition on migrant farm workers. And as I finished my projects and I spent more time in where I live in suburban Los Angeles, and we saw this recession kick in, we were seeing people and lines at food pantries grow. And as I walked the neighborhood with my dog, I was seeing fruit trees dropping fruit into the streets and wasted. And a friend of mine had a tangerine tree in her backyard, and the same thing was happening there. And I said to her, Heather, I want to try this experiment. Would you allow me to harvest the tangerines off your tree and get it to a local food pantry? I did a little research online, and I found out that there was this wonderful federal law called the Good Samaritan Act that was one of the last bills that Clinton signed into law. And what it did is it removed any liability for a food donor to a food pantry or a food bank, assuming that you gave the produce or the food in good stead, meaning you knew that you were not dealing with something that was tainted or would get anyone sick. And so by taking that level of liability off me and off of the food pantry, they were willing to accept backyard produce. I put an ad on Craigslist. Remember Craigslist from way back when? And I had 6 replies. I got one person to show up. We dumpster dived at Costco for some boxes, and we went over to my friend's house. And over the course of 3 successive weekends, we harvested 800 pounds of oranges and tangerines from her trees. Every piece of fruit went to a food pantry called Sova, about 2 miles from my home. And they were like, great, when's more coming? And I looked at this volunteer and I realized again, from 15 feet up in that tree, one neighbor had grapefruit, one neighbor had pomegranates, one neighbor had avocados. I'm like, this idea is much bigger than this one backyard. And right then and there, we were off to the races. We amassed through bulletin boards, literal, bulletin boards in Starbucks, and a little bit of very, very early social media. It was just taking off then. Hundreds of volunteers in the LA area. And by the end of the first year, we had harvested by hand over 100,000 pounds of backyard produce, most of it citrus, which again is a very nutritious item. It holds long time. And it's a very rare thing for food pantries and food banks to get nutritious food. So there were all these wins. We used to say it wasn't a win to the, win-win. It was a win to the fourth. Volunteers got this really amazing experience of being a change maker within a few hours. Homeowners had their trees cleared of produce that would otherwise go to vermin or become trash. Pantries were receiving free fresh produce on a regular basis. And most importantly, food insecure individuals were getting food that they could not get otherwise. So there were all these wins to it. And we got, thankfully, the wind at our back on this, and the organization took off. We formed a nonprofit. We raised money to buy our first van, and we hired our first employee. Soon after that, we added a farmers market recovery program. Again, the staff of Food Foward has been instrumental in coordinating these events, but it is populated by volunteers. And pre-pandemic, in a good year, we would see between 4,000 and 5,000 unique volunteers through Southern California, mostly in Ventura and LA County, populating these events, doing leadership roles, being ambassadors of different kinds. And it gave us this amazing sense of just being part of a solution, where you took what would otherwise be two negatives and you made them positives. The big kahuna came about 4 or 5 years later, when we started getting calls because, due to website optimization, our name kept rising in searches around food waste and food donations and produce. And we started getting calls from wholesalers who had entire shipments that they were trying to move. We learned so much about food waste in those first few years, such as that basically if you had a little bit of a browning on the tip of a mango, the entire shipment would be refused and it would get dumped. Same thing would happen for oversized zucchinis or onions that might have been a little bit too this or too that. And we realized that there was a huge opportunity, with Los Angeles being the gateway for more food than any other city on the continent, that between the backyards, the hundreds of farmers markets that were here, and most importantly then the wholesale district, which fed the entire nation, that we could actually start a wholesale program that would lift Food Forward to a whole new level. And that's what we did. We had a pilot grant that we promised 300,000 pounds of wholesale produce in that first year, and we delivered 4.1 million. And ever since then, it's been this kind of crazy race to catch up with what we're doing. And, you know, to just bring you up to speed and the audience up to speed on where we went through COVID is, we saw this as a social imperative for us to step up. It was almost like the last 10 years had been a dress rehearsal. And what happened was we had just opened a warehouse with refrigeration to hold some of this produce longer than we were able to before then. And we went from a 25 million pound a year influx of produce and distribution to 60 million pounds in 1 year. So a 250% increase during that first year of COVID. And we're still catching up from it. It's been an amazing, humbling, but incredibly impactful time, as Nkemblem said. And I'm just incredibly privileged to keep leading the organization and really grateful for the opportunity.
To learn more about kind of the current state, how this all began, Rick shared some amazing remarks on the inspiration and the why and all of the things that were part of the foundation and your ability to literally serve millions of people and position food as a human right. So, in Kendallum, let's talk about how it all began. 2009 was the year, started with a backyard harvest. Let's talk about that, the earliest days, and then compare that to current state.
And so I appreciate that question, Lori. So definitely want to start with the beginning. But one thing that I've noticed just coming in as a communications director, everyone has sort of met this organization at different points of its journey. And what was inspiring for me coming into this wonderful story was the fact that it started literally with one fruit. And from there, it started with volunteers. It wasn't a team. It wasn't a full-on staff. And it sort of really speaks to the mission of this organization. The fact that it started with just one fruit, just having volunteers inspired just to pick fruit and to be able to get it to hunger relief agencies so that we're feeding the community. So what I've always loved about this story is that there's just so many points of taking it from one fruit. And now that we've reached this sort of milestone of 250 million, Food Forward, just in a matter of less than like 20 years, this Food Forward has this really sort of tremendous story. And what inspired me about this organization is the fact that everyone has met us in different points. When I started at this organization, when I shared my story about I'm going to join the Food Forward family, they always started with, oh, I remember Food Forward. It wasn't because they were invested in them now. It was just the fact that, oh, I know this organization simply because of their mission of recovering fruits. And so the idea of starting with one tangerine and inspiring individuals to understand the impact of not only nutritious food, but the impact of being able to recover that food just from an environmental lens, that's helped us be able to tell a story and differentiate us as an organization from other I would say hunger relief organizations. And every organization is very inspirational in their methods, but what drew me specifically to this organization was just the method of how we fed food insecure communities. And that's specifically related to just it's food recovery, but there's an environmental impact to that. And what's important about that part of that, our story, is just that a lot of times when we say, when individuals are told, oh, how can I impact the environment? How can I help? That's a pretty sort of, I would say, an overwhelming sort of task to understand. But as an organization, we were able to give individuals, communities, tools on how to do that. And that goes back to something that's related to the Produce Mom's mission about just nutritious food, healthy food, and impact, getting that on people's tables itself. So really just the fact that we give people intangible ways of doing that, but it's right in your kitchen. There's a real way of doing it. It's right in your backyard. But I always go back to what inspired me to join this organization. We all want to have an impact. We all want to do that, but a lot of times that's just overwhelming. Like, how do you do that? And we give our volunteers, we give our staff, we give our team. I've taken this to my family. Please stop wasting food. There's ways to not just simple things as not overbuying. That's really just a key thing as well. Utilizing your freezer. So it's really just something that you can take, just something that we do on a regular basis, and just showing everyone a way of how we can help the environment, how we can help hunger communities that are experiencing. And I never want to say hunger, but I want to say like just food insecure communities, because there's hunger, but there's also the nutritious aspect of that. And as someone who understands that and understands nutrition and how that has a long-term impact in just how our health, it's just really been a motivational organization to work for.